Economic schools come and go, their predictions failing spectacularly while their advocates scramble to revise their theories. Yet for over a century, one method has remained undefeated: praxeology, the logic of human action. While Keynesian economists failed to predict the stagflation of the 1970s, the dot-com crash, or the 2008 financial crisis, Austrian economists using praxeological reasoning warned of each disaster before it struck. The difference isn't luck or superior intuition. It's method. While other schools build their theories on mathematical models that treat humans like particles in physics, praxeology begins with the undeniable reality that humans act purposefully to improve their conditions. This single insight, properly developed through rigorous logical deduction, yields economic laws as certain as those found in geometry. Today, as America faces inflation, debt crises, and economic uncertainty, understanding why Austrian economics never fails isn't merely academic, it's essential for navigating the chaos created by decades of interventionist policies. The method I developed doesn't just explain economic phenomena, it reveals why government attempts to fix the economy invariably make problems worse. Chapter 1: The Foundation: Human Action as Universal Truth. All sound economic reasoning must begin with one incontestable fact: humans act. This isn't a hypothesis requiring empirical verification, it's a logical axiom that cannot be denied without self-contradiction. Even the act of denying human action is itself an action, demonstrating the universal and necessary nature of this truth. From this foundation, we can deduce with mathematical certainty that every action implies choice, every choice implies preference, and every preference implies value rankings. When someone chooses to spend their Friday evening reading rather than watching television, they reveal through their action that they value the reading experience more highly than any alternative use of their time. This revealed preference is more reliable than any survey or questionnaire, because actions require real sacrifice while words cost nothing. This is why praxeology succeeds where mathematical economics fails. The econometricians try to discover economic laws by studying historical data, as if human action could be reduced to mechanical relationships like those governing planetary motion. But human beings aren't billiard balls following predetermined paths, they're conscious actors who learn, adapt, and change their behavior based on new information and changing circumstances. Consider how this applies to price formation. Mathematical economists create elaborate supply and demand curves, then wonder why real markets don't behave according to their models. But praxeology reveals that prices aren't determined by abstract curves, they emerge from the actual choices of individual actors, each pursuing their own purposes with limited resources. When you understand that every purchase represents someone's judgment that the item is more valuable than the money they're giving up, you understand pricing better than any mathematical equation can teach. The beauty of praxeological reasoning is its logical rigor. Unlike empirical sciences that must constantly revise their theories as new data emerges, the laws of human action are timeless and universal. A logical truth deduced from the axiom of action applies equally in ancient Rome and modern America, in socialist Venezuela and capitalist Singapore. Human nature doesn't change, and neither do the logical implications of purposeful behavior. This is why Austrian economics anticipated the failure of socialist calculation while mainstream economists praised Soviet planning. When you understand that rational economic calculation requires market prices, and market prices require private property and voluntary exchange, the impossibility of socialist central planning follows with logical necessity. No amount of empirical data can overturn a logical demonstration. Chapter 2: The Deductive Method: Logic over Statistics. While mainstream economists worship statistical correlations and regression analyses, praxeology proceeds through pure logical deduction. This isn't anti-empirical, it's pre-empirical. Before you can meaningfully interpret economic data, You must first understand the logical structure of human action that generates the data. Consider business cycle theory. Keynesian economists examine historical patterns of boom and bust, construct mathematical models based on observed correlations, then express bewilderment when their predictions fail. They see cycles as mysterious, almost supernatural phenomena requiring government intervention to prevent or moderate. But Austrian business cycle theory deduces the inevitability of boom-bust patterns from the logical requirements of sound economic calculation. When central banks create artificial credit expansion by lowering interest rates below their natural market level, they necessarily distort the information system that coordinates production across time. Entrepreneurs, receiving false signals about consumer preferences and available capital, begin projects that cannot be completed profitably once the artificial stimulus ends. This isn't a statistical correlation, it's a logical necessity. Any attempt to boost economic activity through monetary manipulation must create the conditions for subsequent collapse, because the manipulation itself destroys the very price system that coordinates economic activity. The timing and severity may vary based on countless factors, but the fundamental pattern is as certain as mathematical proof. The deductive method also explains why Austrian economists can make unconditional statements about economic policy while mainstream economists hedge their predictions with endless qualifications. When we say minimum wage laws increase unemployment among low-skilled workers, we're not making a statistical prediction subject to revision, we're stating a logical truth. If employers are forced to pay more than a worker's productivity justifies, they will either substitute machines for labor, reduce hours, or eliminate positions entirely. No empirical study can overturn this logical relationship, though politicians may obscure its effects with various interventions. This logical approach allows Austrian economists to cut through the complexity that paralyzes mainstream analysis. While Keynesian economists debate whether fiscal stimulus should be $1.2 or $1.8 trillion, Austrian economists recognize that the entire premise is flawed. You cannot create wealth by redistributing it from productive private uses to politically determined government spending. The multiplication effects and velocity calculations are elaborate mathematical fantasies that ignore the basic logic of human action. The deductive method also explains why Austrian predictions about inflation, housing bubbles, and debt crises prove accurate decade after decade. We're not forecasting based on trend analysis or econometric models, we're identifying the logical consequences of specific government interventions. When the Federal Reserve expands the money supply to finance deficit spending, monetary inflation must occur regardless of what consumer price indices temporarily show. Understanding this methodological difference is crucial for anyone seeking genuine economic knowledge rather than politically convenient pseudoscience. Chapter 3: Methodological Individualism, the only valid approach. Economic phenomena don't emerge from mysterious collective forces or aggregate statistical relationships. They result from the purposeful actions of individual human beings. This principle of methodological individualism isn't a political preference, it's a logical requirement for understanding social phenomena. Consider unemployment statistics. Mainstream economists speak of unemployment rates and labor markets as if these were objective realities independent of human action. But unemployment isn't a thing. It's a description of individual situations. Each unemployed person represents someone whose skills, at current wage rates and working conditions, don't match what employers are willing to pay. Understanding unemployment requires analyzing the choices and constraints facing actual individuals, not manipulating aggregate data. When government creates unemployment through minimum wage laws, the process works through individual decisions. Employers facing higher labor costs must decide how to adjust, reduce hours, eliminate positions, substitute capital for labor, or raise prices. Workers must decide whether to accept available opportunities at market wages or remain unemployed while seeking better offers. Each decision reflects individual value judgments that no statistical aggregate can capture. This is why macroeconomic interventions invariably produce unintended consequences. Policymakers think they can manipulate aggregate variables like consumption or investment without considering how their interventions affect individual incentives and choices. But consumption isn't performed by the economy, it's performed by millions of individual consumers, each making personal decisions based on their own circumstances and preferences. Take the 2008 financial crisis. Government officials and Federal Reserve economists focused on aggregate housing prices, mortgage origination volumes, and bank capital ratios. But the crisis emerged from millions of individual decisions, homebuyers choosing to purchase with no money down, lenders choosing to approve loans they knew were risky, rating agencies choosing to inflate security ratings, and politicians choosing to pressure banks to make loans to unqualified borrowers. Each participant acted rationally given the artificial incentives created by government policy. Homebuyers reasonably concluded that housing prices could only rise when government-sponsored enterprises guaranteed their mortgages. Lenders reasonably securitized risky loans when government agencies promised to purchase them. Rating agencies reasonably inflated ratings when government regulations required institutional investors to purchase only highly rated securities. The Austrian approach examines how these individual responses to government interventions necessarily created systemic instability. When you understand that each market participant was responding rationally to distorted incentives, the crisis becomes predictable rather than mysterious. Methodological individualism also explains why central planning fails regardless of planners' intelligence or good intentions. Socialist calculation isn't impossible because planners lack information, it's impossible because economic calculation requires the value judgments of millions of individual consumers expressing their preferences through voluntary market exchanges. No computer, regardless of processing power, can replicate the knowledge creation process that occurs when individuals risk their own resources pursuing profit opportunities. This principle applies equally to partial interventions in market economies. Price controls don't fail because bureaucrats set the wrong numbers. They fail because prices aren't numbers set by authorities but information signals generated through voluntary exchanges between individuals pursuing their own purposes. Understanding methodological individualism transforms how you analyze economic policy. Instead of asking whether interventions achieve aggregate statistical targets, you ask how they affect individual incentives and the information systems that coordinate individual plans. Chapter 4: Critique of Mathematical Economics: Why Numbers Lie. Modern economics has become increasingly mathematical, with young economists spending years mastering calculus and statistics while remaining ignorant of basic economic logic. This mathematization represents a fundamental methodological error that explains why mainstream economics fails so consistently to predict or explain economic phenomena. Mathematics excels at describing relationships between quantifiable variables in the physical sciences. When studying planetary motion, we can measure mass, velocity, and gravitational forces with precision because these are objective physical properties. But economic phenomena involve human choices, preferences, and subjective valuations that cannot be measured in the same way. Consider utility theory, which attempts to quantify human satisfaction. Economists speak confidently about utility functions and marginal rates of substitution, creating elaborate mathematical models based on the assumption that preferences can be measured and compared. But preferences exist only in the minds of acting individuals and cannot be measured by outside observers. When I choose coffee over tea, I reveal that I prefer coffee in this specific situation, but no mathematical relationship can capture the intensity of my preference or predict my choice in different circumstances. The mathematical approach fails even more spectacularly when economists attempt to aggregate individual preferences into social welfare functions. They assume they can add, subtract, and compare the utility of different individuals as if happiness were as measurable as temperature. But interpersonal utility comparisons are meaningless. There's no scientific way to determine whether one person's satisfaction from a policy change outweighs another person's dissatisfaction. This is why cost-benefit analysis produces such absurd results. Government economists assign dollar values to human lives, environmental amenities, and future generations' welfare, then pretend their calculations represent objective scientific analysis. But these numbers reflect arbitrary assumptions about discount rates, risk preferences, and value judgments that have no scientific foundation. Mathematical economics also fails because it treats economic relationships as if they were mechanical or physical constants. Econometricians estimate demand elasticities from historical data, then use these estimates to predict consumer responses to policy changes. But human beings learn and adapt their behavior based on changing circumstances. The relationship between price and quantity demanded isn't a physical law like the relationship between pressure and volume in gases. It's a description of human choices that can change as people's knowledge and circumstances evolve. The Austrian business cycle theory illustrates this problem perfectly. Mathematical models of the economy assume stable relationships between variables like interest rates, investment, and employment. When these relationships break down during crises, economists express surprise and revise their models. But Austrian theory recognizes that monetary intervention necessarily changes how market participants behave, making previous statistical relationships irrelevant. During the 2008 crisis, mathematical risk models failed catastrophically because they assumed that housing price correlations would remain stable. But government intervention had created artificial correlations that broke down precisely when accurate risk assessment became most crucial. The models weren't wrong because mathematicians made calculation errors. They were wrong because mathematical modeling cannot capture the dynamic, adaptive nature of human action. This doesn't mean empirical observation has no value in economics. Historical data can illustrate economic principles and help us understand how general laws manifest in specific circumstances. But data cannot establish economic laws, which must be derived through logical analysis of human action. Statistics can show that minimum wage increases coincide with employment decreases, but only praxeological reasoning can explain why this relationship is logically necessary rather than merely coincidental. Chapter 5: The Information Problem: Why Markets Work and Planning Fails. The fundamental challenge in any economic system is coordinating the productive activities of millions of individuals, each with limited knowledge and different goals. This coordination problem reveals why free markets succeed while central planning inevitably fails, regardless of planners' intelligence or computational resources. In a market economy, prices serve as information systems that communicate crucial knowledge throughout the economy without requiring central coordination. When oil becomes scarcer, rising prices simultaneously inform consumers to reduce consumption, signal producers to increase exploration and development, and encourage development of substitute technologies. No central authority needs to gather information about oil reserves, consumption patterns, or technological alternatives. The price system automatically coordinates responses across countless independent decision-makers. This coordination occurs through what I call the information cascade of market processes. Each individual, pursuing their own purposes with their limited knowledge, generates information that becomes available to others through market prices. An entrepreneur who discovers that consumers will pay premium prices for organic vegetables creates information about consumer preferences that influences farmers, distributors, and other entrepreneurs without requiring any central data collection. The beauty of this system is that it utilizes knowledge that could never be centrally gathered or processed. The farmer knows soil conditions on his specific land, weather patterns in his region, and local labor availability. The consumer knows her dietary preferences, budget constraints, and family circumstances. The entrepreneur knows market opportunities and production possibilities that exist only in his immediate environment. This dispersed, tacit knowledge cannot be communicated to central planners but is automatically utilized through market processes. Central planning fails because it attempts to coordinate economic activity without access to this dispersed information. Even if planners could somehow gather current data about production capabilities, consumer preferences, and resource availability, this information becomes obsolete the moment circumstances change. By the time data is collected, processed, and incorporated into central plans, the economic reality it describes no longer exists. Consider how Soviet planners attempted to determine appropriate production levels for consumer goods. Without market prices reflecting actual consumer preferences, they had no way to determine whether society would benefit more from additional shoes or additional shirts. They could conduct surveys, but people's stated preferences differ from their actual choices when spending their own money. They could examine consumption patterns in market economies, but these reflect different income levels, relative prices, and cultural preferences that don't apply to Soviet conditions. The information problem explains why partial planning also fails. When government attempts to improve market outcomes through regulations, subsidies, or controls, it necessarily operates with less information than market participants possess. Rent control advocates may believe they're helping tenants, but they lack information about maintenance costs, landlord preferences, and tenant behavior that property owners possess. Price controls on gasoline may seem reasonable to politicians, but they lack information about refining costs, distribution networks, and consumer substitution patterns that market participants automatically incorporate into their decisions. Even modern computational technology cannot solve the information problem. Big data and artificial intelligence can process vast amounts of information, but they cannot access the tacit, dispersed knowledge that exists only in the minds of individual actors. A computer can analyze millions of past transactions, but it cannot know that a particular consumer's preferences have changed due to a new health diagnosis, or that a producer has discovered a cost-saving innovation that hasn't yet been implemented. The information problem also explains why democratic planning doesn't solve the coordination challenge. Voting on economic decisions cannot reveal the intensity of preferences or the complex trade-offs that individuals face. When voters approve spending on education, they don't specify whether money should go toward teachers, technology, buildings, or administration. These detailed decisions require the kind of specific knowledge that only emerges through voluntary market processes. Understanding the information problem transforms how you evaluate economic policies. Instead of asking whether government intervention produces better aggregate outcomes, you ask whether bureaucratic decision-making can access and utilize information more effectively than voluntary market processes. Chapter 6: Praxeology in Action, Real-World Applications. Praxeological reasoning provides practical insights for understanding and navigating economic reality. Unlike mathematical models that work only under artificial assumptions, praxeological analysis applies directly to the complex, dynamic situations individuals and businesses face daily. Consider entrepreneurship, which mainstream economics treats as a mysterious, black box that somehow converts inputs into outputs. Praxeology reveals entrepreneurship as the driving force of all economic progress, the human capacity to identify opportunities for better satisfying consumer desires and acting on those insights despite uncertainty about future conditions. When an entrepreneur notices that people in her neighborhood travel long distances to find good coffee, she identifies an arbitrage opportunity. The difference between current conditions, inconvenient coffee access, and potential conditions, convenient local coffee shop, represents profit potential. Her entrepreneurial action, opening a coffee shop, simultaneously serves consumer desires and tests her judgment about market conditions. Success means she correctly identified unmet consumer needs. Failure means she misjudged demand, costs, or competitive conditions. This process cannot be captured in mathematical models because it involves subjective judgments about uncertain future conditions. The entrepreneur must assess consumer preferences, estimate costs, evaluate competitive threats, and predict regulatory changes without complete information. No formula can determine whether opening a coffee shop will succeed. Success depends on the entrepreneur's ability to read market signals and adapt to changing circumstances. Praxeological analysis also illuminates investment decisions. When choosing between stocks, bonds, or real estate, investors aren't applying mathematical optimization formulas. They're making subjective judgments about future economic conditions based on their analysis of current market signals. The sophisticated investor who understands Austrian monetary theory recognizes that Federal Reserve policies create artificial investment cycles, leading him to adjust his strategy accordingly. During periods of artificial credit expansion, praxeologically informed investors recognize that rising asset prices may reflect monetary inflation rather than improved economic fundamentals. Instead of following momentum strategies that work during bubble phases, they position themselves defensively for the inevitable correction. This explains why Austrian-oriented investors often outperform during major market crashes. They understand the logical structure underlying boom-bust cycles. Employment decisions also demonstrate praxeological principles. When an employer decides whether to hire an additional worker, she's not calculating marginal productivity functions. She's making subjective judgments about whether the worker's contribution will exceed the total cost of employment, including wages, benefits, training, and regulatory compliance costs. Government interventions that increase employment costs or uncertainty make these calculations more difficult, leading to reduced employment even when aggregate demand appears strong. The worker's perspective reveals complementary insights. When deciding whether to accept a job offer, workers consider not just wages but also working conditions, advancement opportunities, commute time, and countless other factors that affect their overall well-being. This explains why identical workers may make different employment choices. They're applying different value scales based on their individual circumstances and preferences. Praxeological reasoning also guides consumption decisions. When families choose between immediate consumption and saving for future needs, they're not maximizing utility functions. They're applying time preference to balance present satisfaction against future security. Understanding this helps explain why low interest rates encourage current consumption while high rates encourage saving, regardless of what aggregate consumption statistics suggest. Even charitable giving reflects praxeological principles. When people contribute to causes they support, they're demonstrating that they value the anticipated results more than alternative uses of their money. This voluntary action reveals preferences more accurately than any survey about charitable priorities. These real-world applications demonstrate why praxeological education is essential for practical success. Business owners who understand Austrian principles make better decisions about pricing, investment timing, and market positioning. Investors who understand monetary theory avoid bubble-driven mistakes that devastate conventionally educated portfolio managers. Workers who understand labor economics negotiate more effectively and choose careers with better long-term prospects. Chapter 7: The Methodological Revolution: Economics as Logic, Not Physics. The transformation of economics from logical analysis to mathematical modeling represents one of the greatest intellectual regressions in modern academic history. By attempting to make economics scientific in the manner of physics, mainstream economists abandoned the very foundations that made economic understanding possible. This methodological error stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes a science scientific. The physical sciences work because they study phenomena that follow mechanical laws discoverable through experimentation and mathematical description. When physicists study gravity, they can isolate variables, conduct controlled experiments, and derive mathematical relationships that apply universally regardless of human consciousness or purpose. But economic phenomena emerge from human action, which is purposeful behavior directed toward improving conditions as perceived by the acting individual. Unlike physical objects that respond mechanically to external forces, human beings make conscious choices based on their understanding of circumstances and their subjective value rankings. This fundamental difference requires a completely different methodological approach. Praxeology recognizes that economics is a logical science similar to mathematics or geometry rather than an empirical science like physics or chemistry. Just as geometric theorems are derived through pure logical reasoning from initial axioms, economic laws must be derived through logical analysis of the implications of human action. The theorem that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line doesn't require empirical testing. It follows necessarily from the axioms of Euclidean geometry. Similarly, the law that minimum wage increases create unemployment doesn't require statistical verification. It follows necessarily from the logic of human choice under constraint. This methodological revolution transforms how we evaluate economic theories. Instead of asking whether theories generate successful predictions in controlled experiments, we ask whether they are logically derived from sound premises about human action. The Austrian business cycle theory succeeds not because it predicts exact timing of recessions but because it demonstrates the logical necessity of boom-bust patterns when central banks artificially manipulate interest rates. The logical approach also explains why economic laws admit no exceptions in the way that physical laws do. When economists claim that minimum wage laws sometimes increase employment, they're making the same error as someone claiming that circles are sometimes square. The logical structure of the relationship makes exceptions impossible. If employment increases following minimum wage increases, other factors must be simultaneously affecting labor demand. This doesn't mean empirical observation is worthless in economics. Historical data can illustrate how general principles manifest under specific conditions and help us understand the magnitude of various effects. But data cannot establish or refute logical relationships derived from the nature of human action. When minimum wage studies show increased employment, Austrian economists look for concurrent changes in productivity, labor regulations, or economic conditions that explain the apparent contradiction. The methodological revolution also clarifies the relationship between economic theory and policy recommendations. Pure praxeological analysis reveals what must happen when specific policies are implemented, but choosing whether to implement those policies requires value judgments that are beyond the scope of economic science. Economics can demonstrate that rent control creates housing shortages. But whether preventing shortages is more important than helping current tenants at below-market rents is a political question requiring ethical judgments about distributive justice. Understanding this distinction protects Austrian economics from the ideological corruption that plagues mainstream economics. When economists claim their mathematical models prove that stimulus spending creates jobs, they're smuggling political preferences into scientific analysis. Austrian economists can demonstrate that stimulus spending diverts resources from productive private uses to politically determined government projects. But whether this redistribution is desirable depends on ethical judgments about the proper role of government. The methodological revolution extends beyond academic economics to practical business and investment decisions. Entrepreneurs who understand that economic relationships are logical rather than statistical make better decisions about market entry, pricing strategies, and competitive positioning. They recognize that successful business models must conform to the logical requirements of profit and loss rather than historical patterns that may not persist under changing conditions. This logical approach also provides intellectual confidence in the face of popular delusions and academic fashion. When mainstream economists embrace modern monetary theory or advocate for universal basic income, Austrian economists can demonstrate through pure logical analysis why these policies must fail, regardless of their temporary political popularity or academic support. Conclusion. The methodological superiority of Austrian economics doesn't rest on the personalities or political preferences of its practitioners, it rests on the logical necessity of its approach to understanding human action. While other schools chase mathematical sophistication and empirical respectability, Austrian economics remains grounded in the timeless logic that governs all purposeful behavior. This explains why Austrian predictions succeed while mainstream forecasts fail. We're not better at reading statistical tea leaves or constructing more sophisticated models. We simply recognize that economic phenomena emerge from human action, which follows logical patterns that can be understood through careful reasoning rather than mathematical manipulation. The practical implications extend far beyond academic debates. Understanding praxeological methodology enables better business decisions, investment strategies, and policy analysis. When you recognize that prices communicate information, that entrepreneurship drives progress, and that government intervention distorts the coordination processes that create prosperity, you gain analytical tools that work in any economic environment. Most importantly, methodological understanding provides intellectual independence from the errors and fashions that periodically sweep through academic and political circles. When politicians promise to solve economic problems through spending and regulation, or when economists advocate policies that violate basic logical principles, praxeological training enables you to identify and explain their errors rather than being swept along by popular enthusiasm. The method never fails because it's based on the unchanging logic of human action rather than temporary statistical relationships or mathematical constructions. In a world of constant economic upheaval and policy experimentation, this logical foundation provides both practical guidance and intellectual certainty.